Olive, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL Services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs today and in the future. DCL serves a broad client base spanning all industries. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Mercy Pilkington, Senior Editor at Good eReader, CEO, Author Options. Mercy is a Senior Editor at Good eReader and the CEO of Author Options, a full-service solutions provider for authors and publishers. She taught in one of the first all-digital classrooms in the country during her years teaching in a juvenile correctional facility. Without further ado, welcome Mercy Pilkington.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I've enjoyed my previous experiences in webinars with Data Conversion Laboratory, and I think you guys do great work. It's important work, and I'm glad you're out there providing these opportunities for listeners. Today we're going to talk about monetizing digital textbooks. One of the things that has been kind of frustrating for the industry is the fact that the ebook revolution has taken place. It's grounded. We know what to expect. We know what books are capable of at this point, given our current technology and our current device penetration in the market. But it seems like the digital textbooks have not caught up in the way that we had first expected they would. They're widespread right now and in great use in college campuses around the country and around the world. We have a lot of organizations that are working on even open source and open access content. We're seeing great opportunities with digital at the college level, but it's not filtered down to the K-12 market yet. And the unfortunate thing is what we see there is at the college level, that's where the students are footing the bill for their textbooks. And so it stands to reason that they needed some support first, since these are individual purchases. But when you look at the K-12 market, digital textbooks make a lot of sense from a financial and taxpayer standpoint. So we're really hoping that the new strides that are being made right now by lots of companies, Macmillan is working towards some, McGraw-Hill Education is, of course, making great leaps in digital textbooks. Inkling is helping out. And so hopefully this will filter down to the K-12 market in a much more widespread way, helping students with academics, of course, and then helping school systems and taxpayers fund all of those opportunities. But the first thing we have to look at is, what is a digital textbook? When digital textbooks first came about, when they were first making great strides in recent years, the initial ones were simply digitized versions of the print flat textbook. So it was simply a portable way to carry it if you had a device, if you had access or internet, if you needed it to access that content. And they weren't really any improvement over the print textbook other than the portability. You were not likely to lose it, of course, and it wasn't likely to be damaged. And because these had to be digitized and because they were only being purchased by a small niche market, they actually weren't even much cheaper. So there really, at that time, wasn't a lot of benefit. But what we're seeing now is that digital textbooks have kind of swung in a complete arc and are even coming back towards their roots. After those initial days, digital textbooks became this complete learning environment with embedded videos, hyperlinks to outside resources, to embedded glossaries, dictionaries, indices, journal articles even, and then eventually made their way to having kind of personalized quizzes and assessment links. Those were never intended for actual assessment by the professor or by the teacher, but they were actually to help the students kind of figure out where they needed to spend a little more time studying in their digital textbook. What we saw was a backlash on those, because a lot of schools, especially at the secondary school and elementary school levels, looked at these great new features. They attended presentations, from the publishers and went, I don't think so. This is too much. This is not what our young students need. And so we kind of stepped away now from these great enhanced ebooks that were replacing digital textbooks at the time. And we're seeing now a really concentrated effort, a much more intentional and focused effort to share only the knowledge that is needed in that unit and to share it in a very personalized way. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we're actually seeing capabilities, platforms that have the capability to assess the student, figure out where the deficits in learning took place with the content material, and restructure what that student needs to read. So we're seeing great advances that are not the same as the print textbook, but also not as flashy, not as look at me and bells and whistles. We're seeing a much more streamlined, focused intention on a relationship with the content. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. When digital textbooks first started to be introduced in a much more widespread way recently, as early as 2010, 2011, we were under the impression somehow that digital textbooks were going to be a tremendous cost savings to the school system. In 2012, we were actually under the impression that K-12 schools could save as much as $250 per student per year. When you look at some of these smaller elementary schools, and many states have regulations on student body size compared to teacher-student ratio, you're easily looking at a school that could have between 400 and 700 students. When you get into the high school level, we're seeing even bigger student bodies. And so this is no small amount of money. Of course, understanding that this is an annual amount. Right now, we're under the impression that the average elementary school spends $100 per textbook per student per year. And when you add to that the fact that there are so many courses, and even your core classes, your math and English especially, your reading, you may actually have 2 textbooks per student, where you have the first half of the year and then the second half of the year, because it just makes for a more cost-effective product to do it that way. So we're talking, sometimes easily 10 textbooks per student per year. So when we saw that the digital textbooks came along and were not a tremendous savings, again, we got this frustration from the public school sector, where they're saying, we were promised it was going to be cheaper, it was going to be more streamlined. We're not seeing the benefit yet. And that also led to this lagging adoption. So when we knew that textbooks, the traditional print textbooks from tried and true publishers, we knew what results those produced. When you took away the savings and you wanted to introduce something brand new into the market, there really wasn't a lot of compelling reason to jump on that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Okay, but how big a market are we really talking about? According to Laura Hazard-Owen, who writes for GigaOM, who produced an article when Apple was first coming into the K-12 textbook market in a big way, in 2012, that textbook market was an $8 billion a year industry. And as you see, we have an estimate of about 50 million public school students in the U.S. And so this is no small amount of money. In fact, academic publishing is the second largest publishing entity in the country in terms of market size and sales, so just behind trade fiction. So this is, again, not a small market that we're talking about. If you look at the quote actually pulled from her article here, you'll see that we had $5.5 billion spent in 2010, and that number is only increasing. And so, again, we're not talking about something where a lot of entities can afford to experiment. When you're already spending $8 billion a year on textbooks for this specific market, that's not money you can play with. You cannot experiment on something that has not been proven, that does not produce great results, and that may or may not even be cheaper. So one of the things that's important to note down at the bottom there, as I mentioned, college students are the consumers of their textbooks. They are actually making the purchase there. Sometimes it's with scholarship or grant funding, and sometimes their own funding in either funding or student loans, excuse me. And they are sort of able to vote with those wallets. So if we're noticing that students are taking issue with a text, or a specific professor is having a problem with the text, they have the power to change that, where in the K-12 market we don't. We have state textbook adoption committees, curriculum standards on a state-by-state basis. And so if a textbook isn't working for a school, it's not as simple as just saying, you know, we're not going to use this one next semester, like you could do in college. So basically, this is not only an $8 billion a year investment on the part of the public schools, it's also a long-term investment. We're going to talk about in just a second adoption cycles, where in different states you have different time periods when a subject matter's textbooks will be adopted again. So many states it's 7 years, and so if a book is chosen or selected, it will be in use for 7 years. This is not a small investment again. So as we're talking about, you're locked in into those years of using that book. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, we're going to experiment with a digital textbook this year, and if we don't like it, we can do something different next year. That is simply not the case in public school. Let's take a look at the next one. Okay, textbooks, beyond just being expensive and being necessary and being funded by taxpayers, they are an incredible responsibility. Again, at the college level, because this is where so much adoption has taken place, we're seeing tons of great innovation in digital textbooks at the college level and digital learning platforms and things like that. You know, here, for lack of explaining it in a better way, we're talking about adults. So they are over 18 years old. If there's something offensive or questionable in the material, you know, you have the option not to take that class again. You have the option to drop out of that class, take it up with the professor. You don't have that option in public school. So publishers are aware that they have a tremendous burden to not only provide the content that the students actually need, as well as providing curricular materials that will help the school produce learners, that will help the school produce students who can score well on standardized tests. But at the same time, it has to be absolutely certain to not be offensive to any group of people, to be derogatory to any demographic, to contain information that is not age appropriate at 13 different grade levels in the public school sector. And so again, there's so much responsibility to produce not only accurate and viable content, but to produce content that will be well received by the community and by the stakeholders. And so in this case, publishers are still having to rely on teams of experts to produce this content. And unlike in the college sector, it's not a matter of having experts at the Ph.D. level who write your biology textbook. You also have to have experts who are Ph.D. level in education to come back and verify this is the best method to teach a second grader multiplication, or this is the best way to teach reading to a kindergartner, word recognition, fluency, things like that. And so you kind of have to have it twofold, where you have your experts in the field, but you also have to have your experts in how children learn best. And the end result of that is these experts are not cheap. They do not work for free. You do not just recycle last year's textbook into this year's textbook. And so that's part of the cost associated with textbooks. The great misunderstanding about digital textbooks was that they were going to be monumentally cheaper, but also much in the same way that ebooks correlate. If I go buy a brand new hardcover trade fiction edition from one of the big 5 publishers, I could easily spend $24, $25 on it, yet the ebook edition could be between $6 and $10. We don't see that ratio happening in digital textbooks because, again, it's not the paper or the ink that costs so much money in textbooks. It's the actual production of the content, and in that case, these experts. And so when we were hoping that digital textbooks were going to be a tremendous savings to schools, that's simply not the case because the file is not the cost, it's the content. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, again, we have bigger considerations besides just the money. So once we sort out the fact that digital textbooks are going to cost, comparison-wise, relatively close to their print counterparts, schools have another concern in implementing digital textbooks. And they do come back to money, but it's not just the money involved in investing in the books. First, we have to talk about the technology and device penetration. Once a school makes the decision to invest in digital textbooks or to go paperless, how is that physically going to happen? Is the school going to provide those devices, or are the students going to provide them? Both systems have great merits and great drawbacks. So what we see now is a lot of BYOD versus system-owned. So under the BYOD, or Bring Your Own Device initiative, essentially a school system puts into place a stringent policy on how students are going to behave with their own devices. And I will say this is an increasingly popular system to go for when we're talking about device penetration for academic use. When we first started to see tablets and laptops and such like that coming into the school system for academic use, we were initially seeing schools absolutely jumping on ownership of the device. And a lot of schools felt like as long as they owned the device, they were allowed to mandate how it was going to be used. And that is largely true, but at the same time, first of all, it's expensive. Schools were having to secure funding or allot budget line items for purchasing all of these devices. A lot of schools actually went to laptops rather than tablets just because they were less expensive. But one of the things that they found out initially, first of all, especially at the high school level, a lot of our digital natives are a lot more tech savvy than their adult counterparts, and so the kids were still basically doing as they wished with the devices. So whether the school owned it or whether the student owned it really was not important to the equation. But the schools that started looking at Bring Your Own Device, basically they felt like their hands were tied. If mom and dad bought that iPad, I don't get to tell you which apps you can and cannot have on it. And so what came into being was this really great policies on saying, I don't care what app is on your iPad, these are the ones you're allowed to use at school, and these are the ways you will behave with or without your device. Part of the real push for Bring Your Own Device was the fact that a lot of students already owned a great device. Maybe they got an iPad for Christmas, or mom and dad had bought them an iPhone when they were old enough to have a cell phone, and we were requiring students to leave those at home. And that's ridiculous. When you own a $600 tablet, fully enabled, it's got Wi-Fi capability, 4G capability, why does the student have to keep it away from his learning environment? But at the same time, you also had to be sure that that student was not going to take his personal property and violate any school rules. Initially, one of the things that we saw a lot of concern with was things like cyberbullying. And so policies had to be written and rewritten to incorporate all the different ways that schools were identifying potential issues. Bring Your Own Device policies, as they stand right now, seem to be fairly well structured, and it seems to be fairly successful. One of the very first things they mandated was that the school would not be responsible in any way, legally, liability-wise, or financially, for the device itself. If you bring the device onto campus, you are basically taking full responsibility for what happens to it and what happens with it. Now, the digital infrastructure was another problem. Whether the school owned those devices or whether the students were allowed to bring personal devices, we had issues with bandwidth. And a lot of schools found that they were not set up to have a student body of 600 students all trying to use Wi-Fi at the same time. And so that's another investment concern that schools are going to have to take into consideration. If we're using app-based textbooks on phones or iPads, excuse me, then you've got issues with how many students can access it in a feasible way and can do it quickly. At the same time, you had online security issues. If you're all using the same network and one student manages to download a virus or upload porn to the entire network, then your entire school is shut down for the day until that can be resolved. There were parent concerns as well. And not just from the fact that we've got an important device, or I've invested in some device for my child and now he's going to be carrying it back and forth, but more importantly, we had a lot of parents who truly, still today in 2014, do not have internet access at home. And so going to a strictly digital environment was going to be impossible for some of these kids, because basically once the bell rings at 3 o'clock, no more schoolwork can take place if they need internet. We also saw a little bit of a backlash. Unfortunately, we had a lot of vocal parents groups and educational groups who were basically saying this just isn't necessary. It's spending money, it's buying flashy technology, it's changing the way everything was done, and you haven't produced results. That is a valid statement, unfortunately. If this is not an improvement, if we are not seeing an increase in test scores, if we're not seeing better retention rates, better graduation rates, a lower dropout rate, why are we doing this? If it has not improved the learning environment, this is money for nothing. And so things need to be implemented, plans need to be put in place to understand how you present that to the community. Are we actually improving the learning environment or not? And if not, you might need to reevaluate how that money is being spent. The last control, and for the last item, excuse me, unfortunately, is content control. And this was a real barrier to digital adoption at the K-12 level, because those textbook committees that I mentioned earlier, they basically are made up of vetted individuals who represent the state and who represent the school systems, and they have the control over what textbooks will be implemented in what subject areas and in which schools and at which grade levels. There was a lot of concern that opening up the schools to digital textbooks was going to somehow result in teachers choosing whatever they wanted to use, and basically there would be no control over the content and the curriculum anymore. And again, just like we can control to some degree how students use their iPad at a school, you can also control how a teacher uses materials in school. Supplemental materials are great. But if you have policies against using supplemental materials, then basically if a teacher does that, then action needs to be taken. Unfortunately, there are lots and lots of great supplemental materials out there. If we're letting textbook committees only vet print books, then we're missing out on a lot of great material and a lot of great content to be had. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. Browser versus app. Now, when digital textbooks first came along, of course, we were seeing a lot of CD-ROM materials, and those were interesting, but not very portable, oddly enough. You could not just simply copy the CD and pass it out. You couldn't. A lot of classrooms didn't have a full bank of computers, and so you could only utilize those materials when your class was assigned that day to the computer lab. Excuse me. But also, when digital textbooks first made their current resurgence, we saw a lot of publishers work really hard and spend a lot of money to produce them as apps to sell standalone textbooks that you could purchase from an app store, from Google Play, or through this company's own website. And unfortunately, those were not the most effective way to use a digital textbook. This year, we're seeing a lot of providers, even of fiction ebooks, even of trade ebooks, are going back to browser-based reading, because basically now that we have the widespread penetration of Wi-Fi in so many locations, here in my town you can even use Wi-Fi at McDonald's, now we're seeing that ability to get online a lot more feasibly, and it was not only more cost-effective and more streamlined, it didn't involve expensive updates to the app itself or downloading expensive updates. It became a very streamlined and cost-effective process to go back to browser-based reading. What this means for teachers is any device that can get on the internet, including her few classroom computers that maybe she got 4 or 5 years ago in her classroom, those can now access the content that everyone else can access. This does still have ramifications for parents who don't have internet at home, but if they have a smartphone that can get online and has feasible data packages, then the student could at the very least access these textbooks by logging in from home. What this really benefited was the students under schools who have a bring your own device policy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You do have some students who just simply cannot afford a device, and there was still this great fear of inequality in not only how the students felt in the classroom, as everyone else has an expensive phone or tablet to use and you don't, but also in the actual learning ability. So when these books were only app-based, then you had a few kids who were stuck sitting together using print books. And that does have a really serious negative impact on the learning environment when that's happening. But now we've got students who can use the computer. You may even have students who own an iPad who prefer to work at a computer in this case because the monitor is bigger or there's a keyboard, a physical keyboard. And so we're seeing that having browser-based digital content for the classroom is not negatively impacting how the students actually access it, and it's actually just providing a lot of choice. Another issue that comes up is that there is already money earmarked in most school systems for this kind of technology. So we've had technology line items for years to buy classroom computers and to replace classroom computers as need be. So that funding's already there. And of course, our desktop computers are wired. They're not using Wi-Fi necessarily unless you're working off an antenna system. And so that's lowering basically the drain on your broadband at the same time. We also have a lot of access that can happen through those wired computers. And so basically students can be on different sites as need be. Parents who do have internet at home are able to log in and see exactly what their students are working on, as opposed to having to find the student's device and access the app and know exactly which one it is. Parents can simply be told, here's the website, here's your login, go ahead and take a look at it. So eliminating some of that concern that parents felt very disconnected from their students' learning material. More importantly, school systems can rest assured that the door has not been thrown wide open and teachers are not going to just grab whatever content they can find and start using it anywhere. Basically, they'll still have a license, they'll still use this set publisher's material, but it will be a lot more streamlined and a lot more feasible to use for a larger class size. Okay, let's move on. One of the things I actually heard very recently, and this came from Matt McInnes, the CEO and founder of Inkling, who is doing a lot of great work in producing digital textbooks for the K-12 market, is that we know textbooks are expensive, but a lot of people don't understand why, and they don't understand that they don't have to be. One of the big problems is we are still selling digital textbooks much the same way that we sold print textbooks. When a textbook adoption committee approves a textbook, the books are purchased from the publisher, and the books are actually physically shipped to the school for distribution to the students. They're signed out, the student's name is written in the front, and basically that's it. That's the book for the year. And whether or not you use all of that book may or may not matter. Unfortunately, what we're finding is adoption committees are realizing we need the most bang for the buck, and they're basically buying whatever textbook fits the curriculum needs and not necessarily the best method of teaching this group of students. And so one of the things I keep hearing from digital textbook developers who take publishers' content and make the digital version is stop selling the book, sell the units. So if we tried that in the print world, that's not going to work. You cannot sell your books and distribute them to students one chapter at a time. It's a big enough headache trying to distribute textbooks at the beginning of the year and take them up at the end of the year. You can't do that 6 more times during the school year in every single subject area. But you can do that with digital. And so now one of the ways that we could look at possibly making digital textbooks less expensive or a smaller investment for schools is to sell them individually in units, because that you can do. You're not distributing physical books or taking them back up. You're telling your students, okay guys, today this is where you're going and here's your link or here's your login. And so you can actually tailor make all of that content that you want to use. Your adoption committee could actually look and pick all the different chapters or units that you want to teach in that subject area and for that grade level. And so this is a lot more cost effective, and it's the best way to make sure that the money you're spending on content is actually going to be used on usable content that meets your goals. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. All right, we started out great. We saw a lot of early adopters and original supporters of digital textbooks. And the really sad dynamic that happens in public education is we are, and I say this as a teacher, we are not quick to make change. We do not like to embrace the newest thing. Here in my state, we actually jokingly refer to 2 other states in the country, Virginia and New York, who are always the pioneers, and the rest of us sit back and watch and see how it works in Virginia before we try it. Unfortunately, what we do is we're great at recognizing individual teachers who've done something innovative. And so when a teacher tries something new, like my child's math teacher who made a YouTube channel just of her demonstrating the math problems so parents at home working homework with their kids could log in and see the math problem, she won all kinds of awards for that locally and from the city government as well as from the school system. So why aren't we all doing it? The reason is we don't embrace change very well in education. We have specific goals we have to meet. We have standardized test scores that we have to produce. And we like what's tried and true. But we started in the right direction with digital textbooks, and we did that by only adopting them in certain subject areas. So places that needed really could stand to benefit from digital textbooks, those subjects got it first, while the rest of us languished with 10-year-old copies of old textbooks with the pages coming out. So we started out going really well and really experimenting, and unfortunately we just kind of let it fall by the wayside and haven't taken up a full adoption yet. Let's take a look at another one. All right, here in Alabama, where I was a teacher and where my children currently attend public school, Pluto is still a planet. It's not because we're backwards, it's not because we're behind or less intelligent than the rest of the country, it's because our state has a 10-year adoption cycle. What that means is every single year, state textbook committees adopt one subject area. And if it's not your subject area's turn, you're not getting new books. So basically, since the discovery that Pluto does not meet the current definition of a planet established in 2006, basically our textbooks still reflect that we have 9 planets in our solar system. There's no discussion of why. There's no insert in the book that can tell us that something has changed. It's still a planet. Unfortunately, here's what happens. Students come to school and they say to their teacher, "Miss So-and-so, I heard that Pluto's not a planet anymore," and the teacher may or may not even know why. I've heard a wide variety of reasons why Pluto is not a planet, including that it's too small and that it has blown up. Those came from students in my classroom, luckily not from their teachers. But what does a teacher have to do in that situation? Either she has to be on top of the information and she stops her class, stops the curriculum she's working on that day to have a great discussion about how the scientific community finally got around to defining a planet and realized that Pluto did not fit. We actually, by the way, almost ended up with 34 extra planets in our solar system because they tried to rewrite the definition to include Pluto, and it wasn't going to work. So basically, Pluto is no longer one of our solar system's planets. A really good teacher who doesn't have the answer is going to tell her students, go to that computer right there and Google it. Or she might say to them, okay, I've got a candy bar for the first kid who comes back tomorrow morning who finds the answer at home tonight. And again, the students went to the internet and Googled it. Why can't she be doing that through her textbook? If we're sending kids to the internet to find out knowledge, to find out information, and to report it back so we can build a lesson around it, why aren't we already doing it in the classroom? Why are we spending money on books that don't reflect Pluto's status as a planet or not? So we're already behaving as though we have digital textbooks. We just don't have them. We have an older model. Now, this is an interesting side note, unfortunately, and it's not with any political slant whatsoever. The science books are not the only textbooks in our state that have not had an adoption year since a major event took place. Our social studies books also have not had an adoption year, and therefore our students throughout Alabama do not have textbooks that reflect that we have ever had an African American president. And again, that is not anything political. It's not an attempt to prevent students from knowing this fact. You turn on the TV and you'll know the fact. But it doesn't look good. It's not good for the learning environment, basically. Nothing that's happened since the last 9 years has really made its way into our social studies curriculum in a major way. But also, it doesn't look good for a school to be teaching information or to be continuing to disseminate information that is not accurate, especially in the fields of science and social studies. Too many important things are happening on a daily basis in both of those subject matters for us to continue to use materials that are this old and this outdated. So let's take a look at the next one. Okay, but it's not just science and social studies that need those updates. So if I had a digital textbook in my classroom, when I actually go to my app or go to my browser-based reading material, which is more ideal, I don't have to do anything. There it is. There is the information. The publisher has made the information available. It's right there in front of my students, and it's quite feasible that they would never have known the information wasn't in there. So when a digital textbook, when the license is distributed at the beginning of the school year, something that happens of profound importance in November that we're studying the following February, those students will never know that that information was not there in August unless they just do the timeline in their heads and realize this didn't happen in August. It happened in November. So those updates are vitally important, and this goes back to selling that content in individual units. There's no reason to sell an entire license or an entire textbook for the year when I could update these things constantly. But if we get past the fact that we really shouldn't be on 10-year adoption cycles for any subject, we have some other conflict areas in public education where, and this came up during the days of print only, where math and English aren't just going to change as fast as science and social studies. And so there's often a question of why are we buying new textbooks when this is old information? Shakespeare has not changed. Well, it does, first of all. Shakespeare, we constantly find new ways of presenting the material. A lot of schools are getting away from presenting it only in Shakespeare's original language, for example. But if you were to watch a movie, for example, and teachers like to show Romeo and Juliet in class, and they show that wonderful 1960s Franco Zeffirelli version, and then the really with-it teachers back then also showed West Side Story. Both of those are very outdated for today's audiences. Those movies are almost 50 years old, if not older. And so what we're seeing is there are updated ways to present old information and to make it relevant today to today's students. What we're also finding, especially in math, is that there are new ways to present the information and new ways to get to the answer. So having only one method of finding the answer in math is not only not true, but also our standardized test scores now, we're expecting students to have more than just recall level answers. We're expecting them to answer, how did you get to that answer? How did you find this solution? And so presenting lots of different ways to find a math problem is actually a better strategy because every student can find a method that works for him and works to his understanding. So we are updating our English, our math, our home economics even, our vocational courses. As we develop new vocational tracks in school, we need constant updates of material. And so it's not just these couple of subjects, and that's what I was saying, is science and social studies really started adopting digital in a broader way than, say, your math and English classes. But really most subject matter does benefit from having access to new information on a regular basis. Let's take a look at the next slide. That brings us right back to the money. Okay, as we said, some subjects we hear quite often, we don't need new English books, or we don't need to buy an update to some of these subjects, excuse me. So basically, if that was the case, we would just say we don't need new textbooks in any of the subjects. If the information that was good enough for your parents and your grandparents was great back then, you know, they're successful adults, or they did grow up to have a good career, why not teach the same exact material that we taught back then? And obviously, that's kind of an invalid argument. Okay, but if all of them were able to publish those units, if they were all able to just invest in the ability to access a unit as it becomes available and as it becomes needed, then you erase all the investment that is being spent on parts of a book that will either never be used in the classroom or that are not being used effectively. One of the issues that we see, especially with science and social studies updates, is when a textbook is adopted in print, and as I mentioned in Alabama, we have a 10-year adoption cycle, any new students or any damaged books or lost books that have to be replaced, we're purchasing those 10-year-old books, even this much later. So if we're coming up on a science adoption year, for example, and we still have books that have to be bought this year, we're buying books that we know were written and published 9 years ago. So we're investing money in a book that we know we're going to get rid of in a year and a half. And that's just not feasible. That is a waste of money in an already cash-strapped industry. So if we could look at shifting towards digital, then we simply add another license. We add another device or another computer to the mix, and we've got another student already ready to learn up-to-date, relevant content. Okay, let's move on. I wasn't going to get to talk about textbooks without talking about Common Core, and this discussion is not about the political ramifications of Common Core. We do have a lot of misunderstanding coming about out there. We have interest groups who are pushing agendas both for and against it, and it's become a really polarizing issue in education. But if you really go back to looking at different issues that have cropped up in public education in America, Everything is a polarizing issue. This is just the most recent. I became a teacher when No Child Left Behind was the driving force, and everywhere you went, interest groups and teachers' unions, everyone hated No Child Left Behind. It basically, it had its problems, it had its benefits, but its implementation was not really relevant. Here with Common Core, and again, we're not discussing its merits or its detractions. What we are discussing is the fact that 45 states adopted it. That means we have 5 that did not. So those 5 are still purchasing textbooks from publishers that do not bring up Common Core, that do not address those standards, that are basically not a change from what they've had. And that's fine if that's what the citizens of those states want. In the states that have adopted Common Core, though, we had a complete change in curriculum. So basically, some schools just decided they would implement Common Core standards as the next adoption year came around. Others threw out the textbooks and found the funding and adopted this whole hog and said, we're going for it in every subject area. Publishers responded. They needed to. So the publishers developed curriculum standards, materials that would go in line with the standards for each grade level and each subject matter, and a lot of them branded the content. So when you see a textbook, many of them now will say, meets Common Core standards, right there on the cover. It's emblazoned in the image. It is not a sticker they stuck on later. It is part of the book. Unfortunately, with the backlash, we have already now, last month, had our first Common Core adopting state repeal it. 30 other states right now are currently considering abandoning Common Core standards. And again, we're not discussing the merits of Common Core or the reasons states should or should not adopt it. The problem is now all that material is wasted. So all that investment that the school systems put into purchasing new materials to meet these standards, the money and the time that publishers spent in not only branding the textbooks as Common Core materials, but also in having their experts rewrite all the books to meet these standards, that's gone. That was a complete waste. And it didn't have to be like that. If we had a digital adoption in place, we could have taken a look at the materials, said, you know what, this one's not working for us, we want a different one. We want an update. We want this taken out. There still would have been the effort and the expense on the part of the publishers in getting the experts to develop the materials, but the waste that went into producing and distributing the materials didn't have to happen. And as we're already seeing states who are saying, this isn't for us, we're not going to do this anymore. Indiana last month voted to repeal Common Core. Well, they're going to need some new textbooks now. It didn't have to be like that. Let's take a look at the next slide. Oh, we're up to our Q&A. So basically, any questions on digital textbook implementation and what schools and publishers need to understand about monetizing and marketing these materials, just go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mercy. We do have several questions that have come in, and the first one being, what do schools who just don't have the funding for this kind of initiative do?
Funding is, schools never have any funding for any initiative. There's never enough money for schools, is there? Basically, they have to get creative with what their expectations are, what they want to accomplish, and how they can possibly do it. I talked about bring your own device. That is a tremendous cost savings initiative. It's a great way to put these devices and digital content into schools, because the truth is a lot of kids already own the devices. When I first became a teacher, I remember you would be suspended if we found you with a cell phone on campus. And that is just not the case anymore. You'll see students proudly walking around with cell phone, outlines on their back pockets, and it's still kind of, to me, I'm still kind of raises the hair on the back of my neck because my instinct is to snatch it up and put it in my desk drawer. But basically, these kids already have these devices. Why not benefit from them and create a habit of using those devices in a meaningful educational way? So that's one step. Now, if we're talking about actually investing in the content, basically it's going to take a focused effort on the part of administration at the state and local levels to say, this is what we're doing. So it could be like some of the states we talked about with Common Core, who just threw out the textbooks and got all new materials and said, well, find the money somehow. It could also be a slow process. Just basically make the policy from this day forward, every textbook adoption, we will look at the digital opportunities first, and we will see if we can find a digital version, a digital textbook version, excuse me, that will meet our needs and be beneficial for our students. And I would definitely start with those subject areas that do rely on current events and up-to-date information first. Not that any subject does not need updated information, but that does have situations where we need to see a much more focused effort on a current matter.
Well, excellent, Marcy. Next question is, what pitfalls are there for bring your own device that schools and or parents need to plan for?
I actually got to spend some time in a bring your own device school, really looking at how they implemented it and what things did work and did not work. I did this for an article for Good eReader and spent several days just observing and talking to teachers and talking to students even. Even got to talk to a couple parents in the line outside waiting to pick up kids. Basically, of course, there are pitfalls, and it really comes from planning for every possible scenario. And of course, you can't plan for every scenario, but think like a student and imagine what's going to happen. Now, of course, one of the major concerns with bring your own device is that cyberbullying behavior or any kind of criminal activity even. We do find schools where they don't want their students on Facebook, or they block this website or that website. So it can be done if a school is willing to do it. The only time it cannot be done is when an administrator says, we're just not going to do it. We can't risk it. I'm not going to take the steps to try. You also find schools that want to be proactive in preventing a problem by assuming there will be a problem. And so basically I found at that particular school that students will rise to the occasion. They will step up to the expectations you outline for them. What many schools have done is implemented a very strict policy of basically what happens to you if you violate the Bring Your Own Device Initiative guidelines. So I know where I was at that time, it was only their second year in having this policy in place and allowing these devices. So at that time, it was not allowed ever to take a picture with your device, phone, tablet, whatever. And obviously there are times that taking a picture is really helpful. Maybe you did a project and you want to send a picture of it to your parents, or maybe you took notes off the board and your best friend's out today. Hey, Miss So-and-so, can I take a picture real quick for her? Those are perfectly logical and feasible things to do with a device in a classroom. But they had to make a policy that said if you take a picture, you are suspended, to prevent these problems until they knew better what was going to happen. Now they've adjusted their policy. You can take a picture, it just cannot have a student in any way in the picture. And that is to prevent things like taking a picture of someone changing in the locker room, for example, for bullying purposes. So even if someone's going to hold up the poster, you can't have their hand in the picture, for example, until we really understand what could possibly go wrong. Otherwise, of course, funding is always a concern. How are parents going to secure a device from theft, from damage, and things like that? We're finding insurance companies, whether through the school, some schools are requiring parents to purchase a small insurance policy just to prevent any legal issues or complaints down the road. But also your own personal homeowner's insurance offers policies or updates. Many parents have found it doesn't cost anything extra, that the device is still covered as long as there was nothing stupid being done, like you weren't hanging out the bus window trying to take a picture of something. But there are ways around these concerns. My biggest concern when I first interviewed the school was, of course, in students who could not afford a device. That was, I think, my very first question. What do you do when you have these 10 students here with a new iPad and those 10 students over there with a new Kindle Fire or an iPhone, and this kid here whose parents simply can't afford it or won't afford it? And right away, the teacher had an immediate answer. And the first answer was, we have our classroom computers. We have students who rotate out, even if you own a device. She'll just say, today it's your turn to work at the computer. And so basically by moving the students around, it was less of an issue. I do think one of the pitfalls is that parents and schools, for some reason, think the students don't know, for lack of a better word, who is poor and who is not. They do. It comes, I mean, we found that even with school uniforms. Some kids' khaki pants come from Ralph Lauren, and some kids' khaki pants come from Walmart. The kids know. And so pretending that they don't know is not going to work, and it's not a logical reason to prevent a great device from being used in the learning environment. I will say, watching these students, I was incredibly impressed by the fact that the administration and the teachers outlined an expectation for the students and for the parents. If you have the funding and the means to provide an iPad for your student, he is expected to work with other students in a group who can't afford it. And it's no mandate, no parent is having their iPad ripped out of their son's hand and handed off to someone else. It's just the understanding that I am able to afford this and I will work with someone who is not. And the students were incredible. Just watching them partner up, it was automatic. There was no, oh, I'm sorry, Michael, I need you to work with Johnny because he's poor. Nothing like that. The students stepped up, and that was really great to see. It was a real character building experience.
Oh, excellent. Marcy, the next question is, how do schools address the Bring Your Own Device initiative when some of the students can afford it and others can't?
I'm sorry, I think I jumped on that person's question there. That was what I saw, is it's just expected that if you wish to bring this device to school because you have one, you will work with others. And I will say, Common Core or not, a lot of state standards now, we're seeing a huge push in collaborative learning. The dreaded group project has always had a negative connotation because you end up with that one smart kid who does all the work, the three goof-off kids who do nothing, and everybody gets a project grade for it. But it's actually a requirement in many state standards now to work together on this because, first of all, if you have a student body made up of 600 individual students who do individual work, what do they do in the workplace? These are students who have not learned to delegate authority, who have not learned to share responsibilities, who have not learned to be a contributing member of a team in a workplace environment. And so we're finding that the schools that foster this group work or collaborative work, their students are better prepared for college and career. And that is, like I said, a tremendous focus right now coming out of a lot of state standards, not just Common Core. So there's nothing wrong with having students work together. So a student who can't afford a device, if the entire school environment includes an expectation that our students care for each other and help each other out and are expected to behave in a certain way, then that problem goes away. So either between the computer lab or the classroom computers or collaborative work, the work gets done, and that's all we care about. It's not about who has the prettier device, who's got the latest update, who's got an iPhone 2 or an iPhone 5. It's about getting the work done in the most structured and productive way possible.
Okay. The next question, Mercy, is if textbooks cost the same in print or in digital, what's the incentive both for the schools and for the publishers?
The very first ones that came out, all we heard about was the portability and the easy access. We also heard about, you don't have to worry about lost textbooks anymore. You don't have to worry about damaged textbooks anymore. And I got to say that those are still very serious considerations. They're not quite the best reasons in the world to adopt a digital textbook, but they are still very compelling when you're looking at funding that is provided by the taxpayers. That slide we saw earlier that said that the average student textbook is $100 and that we can save about $250 a year per student. That $250 per year, that's lost and damaged textbooks. So if textbooks cost the same and we can save this much money by switching to digital, it's because of that. Just for the daily housekeeping issue of you're never going to forget your textbook in your locker. You're never going to be unprepared for class because you can't find your textbook. And again, if you're not someone who is immersed in a public school environment every day, that might seem like a silly reason, but it's not. That speaks to everything down to including behavior issues in the classroom. So our students who are coming unprepared for class, with or without their materials for a variety of reasons, that leads to discipline issues, which leads to consequences, which leads to lack of success in school. So studies have shown that our dropout rate is fueled by students who've had serious discipline issues in school. And it starts right there at the classroom level. When a student's not prepared for class or doesn't have his homework because he didn't bring his materials home, that leads to discipline problems, which, again, we've proven leads to dropout. And so basically those are very minor or almost frivolous considerations at looking at digital, but you're stripping away a lot of the problems that we find in a print environment. More importantly, though, of course, are those updates I've been harping on. Basically, if a textbook isn't working for your school system, if you're not happy with the results, if you feel like, even this year's group of learners, that's not the best for this single year's group of students in the 5th grade, you can swap it out. You can get a different one because you have a license with that publisher. You could say, you know what, we used Voyager Reading last year. This year we want to go to Star Reading. Okay, you can do that. My children's school, we actually have a very small but growing immigrant population from a variety of countries that all do speak Spanish. So we could basically look from year to year and say it's not enough just to have curriculum that speaks to a Spanish-speaking population. This year, more of the kids are from Ecuador, which is not Mexico, which is not Spain. So you can't just lump categories together. So with digital textbooks, besides those important updates of new information, you can tailor the content to the population you have on a year-to-year basis.
Well, thank you, Mercy. Those were all the questions that we received. Thank you for this very informative webinar, and thank you, everyone, for attending. This concludes today's broadcast. You can access the recorded version in the webinar archive section of our website, which is www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, June 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, titled Best Practices for Enterprise-Based Document Capture, presented by Ari Gross, CTO and CEO of C-Vision Technologies. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.